a young man walks the sun-bleached paths of ancient Athens, listening more than he speaks, watching more than he argues. Within a few decades, kings will seek his counsel, empires will lean on his ideas, and for over 2,000 years, humanity will mistake his shadow for truth itself. This is the story of the man who tried to understand everything, and nearly did. The world Aristotle entered was not calm, ordered, or quietly philosophical. It was loud with argument, thick with smoke from burned ideals, and restless with uncertainty. Greece, once confident in its gods, its city-states, and its sense of destiny, was unraveling. The Peloponnesian War had ended only a few years earlier, leaving Athens humiliated, economically wounded, and psychologically exhausted. Democracy, once its proudest invention, felt fragile, even dangerous. People no longer argued merely to discover truth, they argued to survive. Ideas had consequences now. This was the Athens that greeted a 17-year-old foreigner from the northern edges of the Greek world. Aristotle did not arrive as a conquering hero or a prophetic voice. He arrived quietly, almost anonymously, carrying the weight of loss. His father, Nicomachus, physician to the Macedonian royal court, had died years earlier. From him, Aristotle inherited not wealth or power, but something subtler and far more dangerous, a respect for observation, anatomy, and cause and effect. Healing the body requires attention to what is, not what one wishes to be true. That lesson had already taken root. Athens, however, did not reward quiet observation. It rewarded persuasion. The city still bore the scars of Socrates' execution, a trauma that lingered like an unspoken curse. The philosopher had been sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. But everyone knew the truth was more uncomfortable. Socrates had exposed the ignorance of powerful men in public. He had asked questions that dismantled confidence. And Athens, frightened by its own reflection, had silenced him. Philosophy had learned a brutal lesson. Thinking too freely could get you killed. Yet paradoxically, this same fear gave philosophy urgency. If ideas could destabilize a city, then ideas mattered more than armies. Aristotle entered this tension like a spark drifting into dry grass. He was not Athenian by birth. He spoke their language but carried a different accent, a different cultural rhythm. He came from Stagira, a small city in Macedonia, a place many Athenians barely considered civilized. To them, Macedonia was half Greek at best, a land of kings instead of citizens, power instead of debate. Aristotle knew this. He felt it in the glances, in the subtle dismissals, in the way he was always slightly outside the circle. That outsider status would never leave him, and it would become one of his greatest strengths. At the center of Athens' intellectual life stood Plato's academy, just beyond the city walls. It was not a school in the modern sense, but a living organism, a gathering of minds obsessed with one question: what is real? Plato, already a towering figure, taught that the world of appearances was only a shadow. True reality existed in perfect eternal forms beyond the senses. Justice, beauty, goodness, these were not found in the messy world of human affairs, but in a higher realm accessible only through reason. To many, this was comforting. After war, plague, and political chaos, the idea of an unchanging truth was a kind of refuge. To Aristotle, it was irresistible and unsettling. He entered the academy as a student, but he listened like a skeptic. Where others were content to debate definitions, Aristotle watched how Plato spoke, how arguments were structured, how ideas were defended when attacked. He noticed patterns, he noticed gaps, and he noticed something else too. The academy was brilliant, but strangely detached from the living world outside its walls. Athens itself was a theatre of contradiction. In the agora, merchants argued prices with the same intensity philosophers argued virtue. Politicians promised stability while plotting power. Artists celebrated human beauty while the city quietly feared decline. Everywhere Aristotle looked, there was motion, conflict, and complexity, none of it easily reduced to perfect forms. He began to ask questions that did not quite fit. Why did certain animals behave the way they did? Why did constitutions rise and fall? Why did people act against their own interests? Plato's answers often pointed upward, toward ideals. Aristotle's instincts pulled him downward, toward particulars, toward dirt, flesh, weather, habit. This tension did not erupt immediately. For years, Aristotle absorbed everything. He read poetry, studied mathematics, dissected arguments, and memorized dialogues. He was known for his intensity, his tireless work ethic, and his unsettling habit of pushing questions one step further than comfort allowed. Plato reportedly called him the mind of the academy, but admiration carried an edge. A mind that sharp can cut its own teacher. Outside the academy, the political atmosphere grew darker. Athens oscillated between democratic revival and oligarchic fear. Public trials were spectacles. Rhetoric was weaponized. Truth was not what mattered most. Winning did. This environment shaped Aristotle profoundly. He saw how language could distort reality, how emotion could overpower reason, and how systems collapsed when they ignored human nature. Slowly, a realization began to form, though Aristotle would not yet name it. Knowledge divorced from reality becomes dangerous. He watched philosophers argue endlessly about justice while unjust men ruled. He watched citizens praise freedom while fearing dissent. He watched religion invoked both to inspire and to condemn. And beneath it all, he sensed that no single discipline, no single lens, was enough to understand a world this tangled. Athens was not just a city. It was a living experiment in human behavior. Aristotle did something radical without announcing it. He began collecting observations, not formally, not yet, but instinctively. He listened to fishermen describe the sea. He noted how craftsmen learned through repetition rather than theory. He paid attention to how children learned language before they learned logic. These details did not fit neatly into Plato's realm of forms, but they felt undeniably real. At night, the city quieted, but Aristotle's mind did not. He wrestled with a silent fear that few philosophers acknowledged. What if the world could not be reduced to a single principle? What if truth was not a ladder to heaven, but a vast landscape requiring maps, tools, and patience? Such thoughts were dangerous. Philosophy prized elegance, simplicity, unity. To suggest that reality was messy, layered, and resistant to total abstraction was to threaten the very project of philosophy itself. Yet the more Aristotle learned, the more he felt boxed in by inherited assumptions. He did not reject Plato. Not yet. He admired him deeply, but admiration was no longer obedience. And Athens, with all its brilliance and brutality, was teaching Aristotle something Plato never could. Ideas live or die in the real world. The city's past loomed constantly. Stories of Marathon, Salamis, Pericles' Golden Age, ghosts of greatness haunted every street. Athens lived on memory, yet feared the future. That fear seeped into its thinking. Conservatism disguised as tradition. Authority disguised as wisdom. Aristotle sensed that something was at stake far larger than academic disagreement. The way humans chose to know the world would determine how they acted within it. If knowledge was abstract and detached, politics would become ideology. If ethics ignored habit and character, morality would become performance. If reasoning ignored nature, science would stagnate before it began. He was still young, still learning, still cautious. But a quiet conviction began to harden. Understanding everything would require looking at everything, not just what was beautiful, but what was ordinary, flawed, and inconvenient. The irony was cruel. Athens, the birthplace of philosophy, was teaching him why philosophy needed to change. And so, while Plato gazed upward toward eternal truths, Aristotle began turning his eyes outward, toward animals crawling in the dust, toward citizens arguing in the streets, toward the structures hidden beneath chaos. He did not yet know it, but the seeds of a grand design were already planted. A design not meant to escape the world, but to explain it. And as the political winds shifted once more, as Athens prepared to redefine itself yet again, Aristotle stood at the edge of a choice that would shape not only his life, but the intellectual fate of humanity: to remain within the shadow of ideals, or to step into the light of reality itself. The decision would not come all at once. It would unfold slowly, painfully, and irreversibly, beginning with a fracture that could no longer be ignored. Plato's academy was not built to train ordinary minds. It was designed to transform the way reality itself was perceived. Olive trees shaded its walkways, and the air carried a quiet seriousness, as though even nature had agreed to lower its voice. Students did not come here to memorize facts or prepare for careers. They came to abandon the visible world and learn how to think beyond it. For Aristotle, this place was both sanctuary and pressure chamber. Plato dominated the academy not through force, but through presence. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if language itself deserved reverence. His dialogues were performances, intellectual dramas where truth emerged not by declaration, but by tension. When Plato spoke of the forms, his students leaned forward, not because they fully understood, but because the idea of perfection beyond the chaos of life felt like rescue. Aristotle felt that pull too. Who wouldn't? After war, betrayal, and instability, the promise of eternal truth was intoxicating. A realm where justice never decayed, beauty never faded, and knowledge did not bend to power. The forms were not just metaphysical objects. They were emotional anchors. Yet, even as Aristotle absorbed Plato's teaching, he noticed a quiet dissonance. Discussions unfolded endlessly, circling definitions of virtue, knowledge, courage, and being. Arguments were elegant, symmetrical, and precise. But they rarely ended in agreement. More troubling, they rarely touched the ground. When Aristotle walked back through Athens after long days at the academy, the city did not resemble Plato's vision. Justice looked compromised. Beauty looked fragile. Knowledge looked deeply uneven. If the forms were real, why did the world resist them so stubbornly? At first, Aristotle assumed the fault was his own. He studied harder. He memorized more. He refined his arguments. He learned to speak in Plato's rhythm, to anticipate objections, to follow logic wherever it led. And Plato noticed. He trusted Aristotle with teaching younger students, a sign of rare respect. Some whispered that Aristotle might one day lead the academy, but admiration did not erase difference. Where Plato spoke of ascent, of the soul rising from shadows into light, Aristotle thought of descent, not falling, but grounding. He wanted to know how knowledge entered the mind in the first place, how perception became understanding, how repeated experience shaped belief. These were not questions about eternal forms, they were questions about living organisms. The Academy valued mathematics as the purest path to truth. Numbers did not decay. Geometry did not lie. Aristotle appreciated this, but he noticed something uncomfortable. Mathematics explained relationships, not causes. It could describe motion, but not why things moved. It could define proportion, but not purpose. Purpose haunted Aristotle. Plato believed purpose came from participation in the forms. A thing was good insofar as it resembled the form of goodness. Aristotle struggled with this. A knife, he observed, was good because it cut well. A horse was good because it ran well. Their goodness seemed tied to function, not resemblance to an abstract ideal. Function implied design, intention, and context, elements missing from the realm of forms. These thoughts remained mostly unspoken at first. Disagreement with Plato was not forbidden, but it was delicate. The Academy was not dogmatic, yet its gravitational center was clear. To challenge Plato too directly was to risk intellectual exile. Still, cracks began to show. One afternoon, a debate unfolded about the nature of knowledge itself. Plato argued that learning was recollection, that the soul remembered truths known before birth. Aristotle listened, then quietly asked how this explained the gradual improvement of skill through practice. If knowledge was merely remembered, why did repetition matter? Why did failure teach more than success? The room went still. Plato answered with elegance, but something had shifted. Aristotle was not rejecting the theory outright. He was testing it against experience, and experience was winning. This pattern repeated. Aristotle questioned the separation between mind and body. He questioned the dismissal of sensory knowledge as inferior. He questioned whether universals could exist independently of particulars. Each question was reasonable. Together, they formed a challenge too large to ignore. The Academy began to feel like a beautifully constructed room with no windows. Outside, Aristotle continued his quiet observations. He dissected animals and noticed patterns in anatomy. He watched how different soils produced different plants. He observed how habits formed, how customs varied between cities, how political systems shaped character. These were not distractions from philosophy. They felt like its missing half. Plato, for all his brilliance, distrusted the senses. He believed they deceived. Aristotle believed they informed, if handled carefully. Truth, he suspected, did not float above the world. It grew out of it. Their relationship grew more complex. Plato respected Aristotle's intellect, but sensed the threat. Aristotle loved Plato, but felt increasingly constrained. The tension was never personal, never cruel, but it was unavoidable. Two visions of reality cannot occupy the same space forever. Then came the moment that would later echo through history. Plato, discussing the ultimate nature of being, spoke of the forms as more real than physical objects. Aristotle responded with a line that would survive centuries. Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth. It was not defiance, it was declaration. The Academy felt different after that, not hostile, but altered. Aristotle's position was clear now. He was no longer merely a student refining Plato's ideas. He was building something parallel, something that could not exist under Plato's roof. And yet, when Plato died, Aristotle was not chosen to lead the Academy. The decision was political, philosophical, and symbolic. The Academy would remain faithful to its founder's vision. Aristotle, brilliant as he was, represented divergence. For a thinker whose life had been shaped by Athens' fear of disruption, this was no small rejection. Aristotle left Athens soon after. It was not exile by decree, but it felt like exile nonetheless. 2 decades of study, debate, and belonging ended without ceremony. The shadow that had once sheltered him now felt too narrow. But something unexpected happened as he departed. Aristotle felt free. For the first time, he was no longer arguing within someone else's framework. He no longer had to translate his instincts into Platonic language. He could follow questions wherever they led, even if they led into mud, blood, or ambiguity. The man who would later systematize all knowledge was stepping into uncertainty, and the world, vast and unclassified, was waiting. As Aristotle moved away from Athens, carrying scrolls, memories, and unresolved questions, a new phase began. Not defined by ideals, but by investigation. The break from Plato was not a rejection of philosophy. It was its expansion. What he would discover beyond the Academy would change how humans approached truth forever. Because the moment Aristotle stepped out of Plato's shadow, he did not look upward anymore. He began to look around. Aristotle did not leave Athens as a defeated man. He left as an unfinished one. The road away from the city felt lighter with every step, yet strangely exposed. For nearly 20 years, Athens had been the center of his intellectual gravity. Its debates had sharpened him. Its tensions had shaped his questions. Now, with the Academy behind him, there was no dominant voice to push against. No towering figure to argue with, no inherited structure to resist. Freedom, Aristotle would soon discover, was both intoxicating and terrifying. He traveled east, then north, moving through regions that did not share Athens' obsession with abstract perfection. His first major refuge was Assos, a small city on the coast of Asia Minor, ruled by Hermias, a former student of Plato who had become a philosopher king in practice, not theory. Hermias valued ideas, but he valued loyalty and survival more. His court was not a place for endless debate. It was a place where philosophy had to coexist with politics, diplomacy, and threat. For Aristotle, this environment was transformative. Here, ideas could not float freely. They had consequences. Alliances mattered. Geography mattered. The sea dictated trade. The land dictated agriculture. Human decisions were constrained by material reality. Theoretical elegance meant little if it ignored circumstance. Aristotle thrived. He married Pythias, Hermias' niece, and for the first time in his life, philosophy intertwined with domestic life. Daily routines, meals, conversations, shared responsibilities offered him something Plato never emphasized: continuity. Life was not a series of abstract inquiries. It was a pattern of repeated actions, habits forming character over time. This realization would become central to his ethics, but first, something deeper began to shift. Aristotle started to observe systematically, not casually, not poetically, systematically. He walked along the coastline, studying marine life with relentless attention. Fish, mollusks, crustaceans. He watched how they moved, fed, reproduced, and died. He noted similarities and differences, not to admire them, but to classify them. Patterns emerged, structures repeated. Nature, he realized, was not chaotic. It was ordered, but not according to Platonic ideals. It was ordered according to function. An animal's organs were shaped by what it needed to do. Birds had hollow bones for flight. Fish had gills for water. teeth varied with diet. These were not imperfect copies of abstract forms. They were solutions. Responses, adaptations. Purpose, Aristotle began to understand, was not imposed from above. It was embedded within living things. This insight was radical. Plato's world began with perfection and explained imperfection as failure. Aristotle's world began with activity and explained form as outcome. A thing was not striving to resemble an ideal. It was striving to fulfill its nature. This simple shift overturned centuries of metaphysical instinct. But Aristotle did not rush to announce it. He tested it everywhere. When Hermias was later captured and executed by the Persians, a brutal reminder of how fragile philosophy was in the face of empire, Aristotle fled once again. This time to the island of Lesbos. The trauma of loss followed him, but it did not harden him. It sharpened his urgency. On Lesbos, Aristotle's investigations deepened. He worked closely with Theophrastus, a younger philosopher who shared his fascination with the natural world. Together, they turned the island into a living laboratory. They dissected animals, catalogued plants, recorded weather patterns, and compared ecosystems. Aristotle was no longer merely thinking about nature. He was thinking with it. He kept notes obsessively. Not polished treatises, but working documents, raw observations, tentative conclusions, revised hypotheses. This mattered. Aristotle was no longer seeking certainty first. He was allowing knowledge to grow gradually, imperfectly. From this process, a method emerged. Truth, Aristotle realized, did not reveal itself all at once. It required patience, repetition, comparison. You gathered particulars before extracting universals. You let evidence lead theory, not the other way around. Where Plato began with conclusions and reasoned downward, Aristotle began with data and reasoned upward. This was not a rejection of reason. It was its discipline. He also noticed something profoundly human. People learned in the same way nature revealed itself, incrementally, through trial and error, through habit, through correction. This applied to ethics, politics, and education just as much as biology. Knowledge, then, was not recollection. It was construction. This realization rippled outward. If knowledge was constructed, then it could be improved, corrected, expanded. It was not locked in a perfect realm beyond reach. It lived, changed, and evolved, just like organisms. Without fully intending to, Aristotle was inventing empiricism. Not the modern laboratory version, but its philosophical ancestor. A commitment to reality as the starting point, a refusal to let beauty override truth, a belief that understanding must be earned through engagement with the world. Yet this approach came with discomfort. Nature did not always cooperate. Some observations contradicted others. Some patterns broke down. Aristotle had to accept uncertainty, probability, and exceptions. Unlike Platonic certainty, this world was textured and uneven. But Aristotle preferred honest difficulty to elegant falsehood. As his confidence grew, so did his ambition. It was no longer enough to understand animals or plants. He wanted to know how everything fit together. Motion, change, causation, matter, form, purpose. The entire structure of reality seemed suddenly accessible, not through revelation, but through method. And method, once discovered, could be taught. When news arrived from Macedonia, it did not feel like interruption. It felt like convergence. King Philip wanted Aristotle to tutor his son, Alexander. The invitation was political, dangerous, and loaded with expectation. Aristotle hesitated. He had found something precious in exile: independence of thought. To return to the orbit of power risked distortion, yet the opportunity was enormous. To shape a mind destined to rule was to test philosophy in the most unforgiving arena imaginable. The question loomed quietly beneath the offer. Could knowledge guide power without becoming its servant? Aristotle did not yet know the answer, but he understood one thing with clarity born of observation and loss. Ideas that never leave the world of thought change nothing. And so, carrying scrolls filled with animals, plants, causes, and questions, Aristotle prepared to step back into history, not as a follower of ideals, but as an architect of understanding. The method was born. Now it would face a conqueror. The road back toward Macedonia felt heavier than any Aristotle had walked before. Not because of distance, but because of consequence. Until now, his ideas had lived mostly among thinkers, students, and the quiet rhythms of nature. In Macedonia, they would meet ambition in its rawest form. Power, unlike philosophy, did not ask to be questioned. It demanded to be shaped, or endured. King Philip II ruled a land very different from Athens. Macedonia was not a city of debates. It was a kingdom of discipline. Soldiers trained year-round. Nobles pledged loyalty to bloodlines, not ballots. Expansion was not a theory. It was policy. Yet Philip was no brute. He understood something Athens often forgot. Knowledge was leverage, and his son, Alexander, would need more than a sword. When Aristotle arrived at Mieza, where the young prince was being educated, he did not find a child. He found a coiled intensity. Alexander was barely 13, but his presence filled space. His eyes burned with restlessness, as if the world already felt too small. He had inherited his father's ambition and his mother, Olympias's fierce sense of destiny. Stories of heroes surrounded him from birth. Achilles was not a myth to Alexander. He was a standard. Aristotle recognized the danger immediately. This was not a mind that needed fuel. It needed direction. Their lessons took place outdoors, under stone arches and trees, an echo of the Lyceum yet to come. Aristotle chose Homer as the foundation, not mathematics or metaphysics. The Iliad became Alexander's mirror. Aristotle emphasized not only glory, but consequence. Rage destroyed Achilles as much as it elevated him. Pride invited tragedy. Greatness without restraint devoured itself. Alexander listened, but listening was not obedience. Aristotle expanded the curriculum relentlessly. Ethics, politics, biology, medicine, geography. He taught Alexander to see the world not as a stage for conquest, but as a complex system. Peoples were shaped by climate. Cultures evolved through necessity. Even enemies had reasons. To rule effectively, one had to understand before commanding. It was a radical message for a prince, yet Aristotle never fully escaped contradiction. He believed some were naturally suited to rule and others to serve. He spoke of hierarchy as part of nature's order. To Alexander, this was not philosophy. It was permission. As months passed, their relationship deepened into something precarious. Aristotle was shaping the mind of a future king. But the king's hunger reshaped the lessons. Alexander absorbed knowledge voraciously, yet filtered it through ambition. Where Aristotle spoke of moderation, Alexander heard strategy. Where Aristotle spoke of unity, Alexander envisioned empire. Still, the influence was undeniable. Alexander developed a respect for learning rare among warriors. He carried books on campaign. He consulted scholars. He sought not only to conquer lands, but to catalogue them. Plants, animals, customs. Everything was to be recorded and sent back to Aristotle. Conquest became data collection. For Aristotle, this was exhilarating and unsettling. He was watching his method scale across the world, but power distorts whatever it touches. As Alexander grew older, the balance shifted. The student no longer merely learned, he chose. When Philip was assassinated and Alexander took the throne, Aristotle was left behind, physically and philosophically. The campaigns that followed were swift and merciless. Cities fell, cultures bent. Alexander spread Greek language and thought across continents, fulfilling, in part, Aristotle's belief in shared rationality. Yet blood soaked the ground beneath that rationality. The world was being unified, but at terrible cost. From afar, Aristotle watched his former student become something mythic, and he felt a quiet dread. Had he armed a storm with reason? Alexander wrote to Aristotle often at first, asking questions, sending specimens, requesting explanations. Over time, the letters slowed. Authority replaced curiosity. The philosopher had given the king tools, but tools do not choose how they are used. This chapter of Aristotle's life ends not with triumph, but ambiguity. He had proven that philosophy could shape power. He had also learned that it could not control it. When Alexander marched east, Aristotle returned west, to Athens once more. He carried with him unmatched experience, the court of a king, the reach of empire, the brutal interface between ideas and force. He no longer believed knowledge alone could save the world, but he believed it could still explain it. And so, as the echo of marching armies faded behind him, Aristotle prepared to build something enduring, an institution not tied to a single ruler, but to inquiry itself. The Lyceum awaited, and with it, his most audacious attempt yet, to organize the human knowledge before the world tore itself apart again. Athens had changed, and so had Aristotle. When he returned to the city, the air felt familiar but strained, like a home that remembered him differently than he remembered it. Alexander's shadow stretched across Greece now. Macedonian authority loomed behind every civic ritual, every political speech, every uneasy compromise. Athens still spoke the language of freedom, but it did so carefully, aware of who now held the sword. For Aristotle, this political tension was both danger and opportunity. He did not return to reclaim Plato's academy. That chapter of his life was closed. Instead, he founded something new, something deliberately different in spirit, structure, and ambition. The Lyceum was established near the temple of Apollo Lysias on the eastern edge of the city. It was open, porous, and alive, not secluded behind walls, but integrated into the rhythms of the city. Here, philosophy would not escape the world. Aristotle taught while walking. The peripatetic tradition, as it came to be known, was not an aesthetic choice. It was philosophical. Thought, Aristotle believed, was an activity. Movement sharpened attention. Dialogue unfolded better when bodies were engaged. Ideas were not frozen objects to be admired. They were tools to be used. The Lyceum quickly became something unprecedented. Students gathered not merely to listen, but to investigate. Aristotle assigned research. He encouraged disagreement. He demanded evidence. The goal was no longer to contemplate perfection, but to understand complexity. Knowledge was divided into domains, each treated with its own appropriate method. Mathematics demanded precision. Ethics tolerated ambiguity. Biology required observation. Politics demanded history. This was revolutionary. Before Aristotle, philosophy sought unity through reduction. After Aristotle, unity emerged through structure. He did not force all subjects into a single mold. He respected their differences. Truth, he insisted, does not wear the same clothing in every context. The Lyceum became a hive of activity. Students compiled constitutions from across the Greek world, comparing how cities governed themselves and why they failed. Others collected animal specimens, recording anatomy with obsessive care. Some analyzed poetry, not as divine inspiration, but as a craft with rules, effects, and psychological power. Aristotle oversaw it all, less like a prophet and more like a conductor. What made the Lyceum extraordinary was not just what was studied, but how. Aristotle insisted on first principles, but he refused to assume them. Everything had to be justified. Definitions were not starting points, they were achievements. A concept meant nothing until its boundaries were tested. Slowly, a vast intellectual machine took shape. Aristotle worked relentlessly. His writings multiplied, not as polished works meant for public admiration, but as dense lecture notes, research drafts, and teaching materials. These texts were tools, not monuments. They assumed effort from the reader. Clarity was earned, not gifted. This choice would haunt his legacy later. But for now, it allowed something unprecedented: cumulative knowledge. Ideas were built upon, refined, corrected. The Lyceum was not dependent on Aristotle's charisma. It was dependent on method. At the heart of this enterprise was a single obsession: explanation. Aristotle believed that to truly understand something, one had to answer 4 questions. What is it made of? What form does it take? What caused it to come into being? And what is it for? These were not abstract musings. They applied to everything, from a chair to a constitution, from an animal to a tragedy. The world, in Aristotle's vision, was intelligible, not because it was simple, but because it was structured. He rejected the idea that chance ruled everything. Accidents occurred, yes, but patterns dominated. Nature, he believed, did nothing in vain. This conviction infused his teaching with optimism. If the world had order, then human reason had a place within it. Yet Aristotle was not naive. He knew systems could fail. He had watched cities collapse and empires rise. That is why he refused to reduce ethics to rules. Virtue, he taught, was not obedience to law, but cultivation of character. A good life required judgment, phronesis, practical wisdom, sensitive to context. This emphasis on judgment set him apart from both idealists and tyrants. The Lyceum became a refuge for minds uncomfortable with extremes. It welcomed uncertainty without surrendering rigor. It accepted hierarchy without worshipping authority. It believed in reason, but not in its infallibility. And Athens watched. Some admired Aristotle's achievement. Others grew uneasy. His Macedonian connections were never forgotten. His proximity to Alexander made him suspect. Philosophy had once again wandered too close to power. Still, Aristotle pressed on. He was racing time now, though he may not have known it. His ambition had expanded beyond teaching. He was attempting something no human had done before: a complete inventory of knowledge. Every subject, he believed, had its proper place. Logic became the tool for thinking clearly across disciplines. Physics explained change and motion. Metaphysics explored being itself. Ethics guided individual life. Politics organized collective life. Poetry shaped emotion and understanding. Each part reinforced the others. The Lyceum was not a school. It was a worldview under construction. And yet, beneath the confidence, tension brewed. Athens was never comfortable with those who seemed too influential, too systematic, too close to power. The same city that executed Socrates had not grown kinder with age. Aristotle knew this. He taught anyway. Because if knowledge was not preserved, if it was not organized and transmitted, it would scatter, lost to war, forgotten by time, distorted by rhetoric. The Lyceum was his answer to chaos. But even the most carefully designed structures are vulnerable to the storms of history, and one was gathering. As Alexander's campaign stretched farther east and news of his growing ambition reached Greece, Athens' patience thinned. The philosopher who had once tutored the conqueror now stood at the center of suspicion. The question no longer whispered, but waited openly in the air. Could a man who sought to explain everything survive a city that feared being explained? The answer would arrive soon, and when it did, Aristotle would face the limits not of reason, but of belonging. If the Lyceum was Aristotle's grand workshop, then logic was the tool he sharpened until it could cut through anything. He did not invent thinking, but he did something more dangerous. He formalized it. He gave structure to reasoning itself, turning intuition into method and argument into machinery. In doing so, he granted humanity an extraordinary power and quietly placed walls around it. Aristotle understood something his predecessors had only sensed. The mind does not merely absorb truth, it moves toward it. That movement could be guided, disciplined, and corrected. Without structure, thought drifted. With structure, it could build. So he began at the beginning. What does it mean to say something is? From this deceptively simple question emerged his categories, fundamental ways of describing reality: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, action. These were not poetic metaphors. They were attempts to map how language attached itself to the world. If words were misaligned with things, confusion followed. Philosophy, Aristotle believed, began with clarity. Then came the syllogism. If all humans are mortal, and Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. The power of this form was not its simplicity, but its inevitability. If the premises were true, the conclusion could not be escaped. Reason became a path with rails. This was intoxicating. For the first time, humans possessed a reliable method to test arguments independent of emotion, authority, or rhetoric. Logic offered neutrality. It promised fairness. It did not care who spoke, only whether the structure held. Aristotle saw this as liberation. But liberation always carries a hidden cost. Logic required definitions. Definitions required boundaries. Boundaries excluded ambiguity. And the world, Aristotle knew better than anyone, was not always precise. Still, he believed that without structure, thought dissolved into opinion. Logic was the scaffolding on which knowledge could rise, so he systematized it with relentless care. Terms had to be clear. Propositions had to be categorized. Contradictions had to be exposed. The principle of non-contradiction, something cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time, became the bedrock of rational discourse. To deny it was to deny the possibility of meaning itself. Here, Aristotle drew a line in the sand. Beyond it lay mystery, paradox, and poetry. Within it lay reason. For centuries, this line would define intellectual legitimacy. Yet Aristotle himself was more cautious than his later followers. He knew logic was a tool, not a mirror of reality. He warned that not all subjects admitted the same level of precision. To demand mathematical certainty in ethics, he said, was to misunderstand ethics entirely. But warnings fade faster than systems endure. As Aristotle's logic spread, it hardened. What began as guidance became gatekeeping. Arguments that did not fit syllogistic form were dismissed. Questions that resisted categorization were sidelined. Logic, meant to clarify thought, slowly became a filter for what counted as thought at all. This was not Aristotle's intention, but it was his legacy. The irony is painful. The man who insisted on observation, nuance, and context built a structure so elegant that later minds mistook it for reality itself. Logic became not a means, but an end. The map replaced the territory. Within Aristotle's own lifetime, this tension was already visible. At the Lyceum, students debated fiercely. Logic empowered them to dismantle weak arguments with surgical precision. Yet Aristotle noticed something troubling. Some students became more interested in winning arguments than in understanding truth. Logic rewarded cleverness. It tempted vanity. Aristotle responded by emphasizing substance over form. He reminded them that true reasoning required true premises. A flawless syllogism built on false assumptions was still false. Logic could preserve error just as efficiently as truth, but logic's clarity was seductive. It offered certainty in a world exhausted by chaos. It promised that if one reasoned correctly, one could arrive at correct conclusions. Over time, this promise grew louder than its limitations. Aristotle also applied logic to language itself. He analyzed how statements functioned, how universals related to particulars, how meaning was constructed. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for grammar, semantics, and analytic philosophy. The human mind, once a mystery, was becoming transparent, or so it seemed, because beneath the precision lurked an unspoken assumption that reality conformed to rational structure, that being itself was logically coherent. Aristotle believed this deeply. Nature, in his view, was intelligible because it was purposive. Chaos was not fundamental. Order was. This belief shaped everything. It allowed science to exist. It justified inquiry. It inspired confidence that understanding was possible, but it also narrowed imagination. If something did not fit existing categories, it was often forced or ignored. Centuries later, when new observations challenged Aristotle's physics and cosmology, scholars would defend the system rather than question it. Logic, meant to serve knowledge, would protect it from change. The cage was built not from malice, but from brilliance. Still, in Aristotle's own hands, logic remained flexible. He treated it as a starting point, not a conclusion. He knew that life overflowed definitions. He knew that probability, not certainty, governed many domains. But once released into the world, logic took on a life of its own. It trained minds. It disciplined language. It shaped education. It became the invisible grammar of Western thought. For nearly 2,000 years, to think clearly meant to think Aristotelianly. The man who sought to explain everything had succeeded too well. As Aristotle aged, he sensed the weight of what he had built. Systems endure longer than people. Ideas outlive intentions. He had given humanity a mirror polished so sharply that it risked mistaking reflection for reality. Yet without that mirror, much would remain unseen. This was the paradox at the heart of his work. Reason both reveals and confines. To think at all is to exclude something. The question is whether one remembers that exclusion exists. Aristotle never claimed finality, he claimed method, but the world would later claim authority. And as his influence spread far beyond Athens, far beyond Greece, the consequences of his logical architecture would shape civilizations, sometimes illuminating, sometimes suffocating. The next test of his philosophy would not come from scholars, but from life itself, from how humans chose to live, govern, and define happiness within the structures he had helped erect. Because logic could explain how we reason, it could not explain why we ought to choose well. For that, Aristotle turned to the most human question of all. After logic had stripped thought down to its bones, Aristotle turned towards something far more fragile. Not how humans think, but how they live. In a world shaped by war, ambition, and political collapse, this question was not academic. It was urgent. What is the point of a life? Aristotle refused the easy answers. Wealth faded, power corrupted. Pleasure satisfied briefly and then demanded more. None of these, he observed, could sustain a life through time. And yet people chased them as if they were final destinations. Aristotle suspected the mistake lay not in desire, but in confusion about its end. Every action, he argued, aims at some good, but goods are layered. We seek money for security, security for comfort, comfort for happiness. Strip away the intermediaries, and something remains. Happiness, but not happiness as feeling, not joy, or excitement, or contentment. Aristotle used the word eudaimonia, a state of flourishing, a life well lived, a condition, not a moment. This distinction mattered. Feelings come and go. Flourishing endures. It stretches across a lifetime, integrating success and failure, pleasure and pain. A good life, Aristotle believed, could not be judged in a single day. It required narrative, continuity, character. Character became his central concern. Virtue, Aristotle taught, was not a rule to obey. It was a habit to cultivate. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the practiced ability to face it appropriately. Generosity was not a single act of giving, but a consistent disposition to share wisely. Virtue lived in the space between extremes, the mean, not as mathematical average, but as judgment tuned to circumstance. This was radical. Most moral systems offered commands. Aristotle offered training. A person did not become good by knowing what goodness was. They became good by doing good things repeatedly until doing so felt natural. Ethics, in this sense, was closer to medicine than law. It healed and strengthened over time. Aristotle drew this insight from observation, not speculation. He watched how people actually changed. He saw how habits hardened into character, how environments shaped choices, how upbringing mattered as much as reason. Freedom, he believed, was real, but fragile. It required cultivation. This emphasis on practice challenged both moral absolutism and moral relativism. There were better and worse ways to live, Aristotle insisted, but they could not be reduced to formulas. Life was too textured for that. Yet Aristotle did not ignore reason. Practical wisdom, phronesis, stood at the center of ethical life. It was the capacity to deliberate well about what was good here and now. It could not be taught through lectures alone. It grew through experience, reflection, and error. Young people, Aristotle noted bluntly, were often poor judges, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked time. This observation unsettled his audience. It implied that moral expertise was not evenly distributed, that wisdom had prerequisites. that some voices carried weight because of lived understanding, not status. Aristotle extended this thinking into friendship. Friendship, he argued, was not a luxury. It was essential to flourishing. Humans were social beings, not isolated minds. The highest friendships were not based on utility or pleasure, but on shared virtue. Friends helped each other see themselves more clearly. They reinforced good habits. They made life intelligible. This belief softened Aristotle's reputation as a cold system builder. He understood intimacy. He understood loyalty. He understood loss. But his ethics were not free of tension. Aristotle believed external goods mattered. Health, stability, even a degree of wealth were necessary for flourishing. This was honest, but uncomfortable. It meant that virtue alone was not enough. Circumstance could wound even the best life. Here, Aristotle diverged sharply from moral idealism. He refused to pretend that suffering could always be redeemed by attitude. Some harms were simply harms. This realism grounded his ethics, but it also made them vulnerable to criticism. Was a good life only for the fortunate? Aristotle did not fully resolve this. He acknowledged tragedy. He acknowledged luck. He acknowledged limits. And yet, he insisted that within those limits, humans possessed remarkable agency. They could shape themselves. They could choose excellence over ease. They could align reason and desire through discipline. Ethics, for Aristotle, was not about purity. It was about harmony. Reason did not dominate emotion. It educated it. Desire was not crushed. It was trained. The soul, in his vision, was not a battlefield, but an orchestra. Still, this harmony required structure. It required communities that valued virtue, education that shaped character, and politics that supported ethical development. A corrupt society, Aristotle warned, made good lives nearly impossible. Here, ethics bled into politics. A good person needed a good city. As Aristotle's thoughts matured, this interdependence became impossible to ignore. The shape of individual happiness depended on laws, institutions, and collective values. Ethics could not remain private. It demanded a social framework. The stakes rose again. Aristotle had mapped the inner life with compassion and precision. Now he turned outward, toward the machinery of power that shaped that life from birth to death. If happiness was the goal of human existence, then the city bore responsibility for making it possible. And that responsibility, Aristotle knew, was where reason faced its greatest test. Because power does not ask what is best. It asks what is effective. And the moment ethics entered politics, the world Aristotle had patiently explained began to resist explanation once more. Aristotle approached politics without illusion. He had lived too close to kings, watched cities collapse too often, and studied human nature too carefully to believe that power could ever be purely rational. Yet, he also refused to surrender politics to cynicism. If ethics concerned the good life, politics concerned the conditions that made such a life possible. The city, Aristotle believed, was not an accident. Humans gathered not merely for survival, but for flourishing. Families formed villages, villages formed cities, and cities existed for the sake of living well. This claim alone separated Aristotle from both tyrants and romantics. Power was not justified by strength alone, nor was freedom meaningful without structure. The purpose of the state was ethical, but how that purpose was achieved depended on form. Aristotle studied constitutions with the same intensity he studied animals. He collected them, compared them, classified them. Monarchies, aristocracies, polities, democracies, oligarchies. Each had strengths and pathologies. No system was inherently perfect. Each could degrade. Kings became tyrants. Aristocracies decayed into oligarchies. Democracies slid toward mob rule. This empirical approach was unsettling. It suggested that political virtue was unstable, that no arrangement guaranteed justice, that vigilance mattered more than ideology. Aristotle rejected utopias. He distrusted theories that assumed perfect citizens. Laws had to account for ambition, fear, envy, and desire. A system that ignored human weakness would collapse under its weight. This realism distinguished him sharply from Plato, whose ideal republic required philosopher kings untainted by personal interest. Aristotle had seen such purity was rare. Instead, he favored mixed constitutions, balances of power that restrained extremes. Stability, not perfection, was the political achievement worth pursuing. The best state was not the most just in theory, but the most resilient in practice. Yet this pragmatism carried moral tension. Aristotle believed some people were naturally suited to rule and others to be ruled. He defended slavery as part of the natural order, a position that would haunt his legacy. To Aristotle, this was not cruelty, but classification. Some lacked the rational capacity for full self-governance, he argued. They benefited from direction. From a modern perspective, this is a fracture running through his thought. Aristotle's commitment to observation led him to accept social hierarchies as natural facts. But observation is never neutral. It reflects the world as it is, not as it could be. In codifying existing inequalities, Aristotle risked granting them philosophical permanence. This was reason's limit. Reason could describe power structures with clarity. It struggled to imagine liberation beyond experience. Aristotle's method excelled at explaining the world. It was less comfortable reshaping it. Still, within these limits, his political vision was strikingly nuanced. He emphasized the middle class as the backbone of stability. Extreme wealth and extreme poverty, he argued, corroded civic life. The middle class, less driven by desperation or arrogance, governed with moderation. This insight echoed across centuries, resurfacing in modern political theory with uncanny familiarity. Education, Aristotle insisted, was political infrastructure. Citizens were not born, they were formed. A state that neglected education undermined itself. Virtue could not survive in ignorance. Law alone was insufficient. Character mattered. Here again, Aristotle tied the personal to the political. He also recognized the power of rhetoric. Persuasion, emotion, and narrative shaped public life as much as reason. Aristotle did not condemn this. He analyzed it. Rhetoric, he believed, could be ethical if used to guide citizens toward truth rather than manipulate them. But the line was thin. Athens knew this too well. As Macedonian influence deepened, Aristotle's position grew precarious. His ties to Alexander made him suspect. The same city that once celebrated debate now watched thinkers closely. Philosophy had become dangerous again. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, the political ground shifted violently. Anti-Macedonian sentiment surged in Athens. Accusations flew. Aristotle was charged with impiety, the same charge that had condemned Socrates decades earlier. History seemed ready to repeat itself. This time, Aristotle refused to play the martyr. "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy," he reportedly said, before leaving the city. He fled to Chalcis, on the island of Euboea. It was a quiet retreat, but not a peaceful one. His health declined. His body, like every system he studied, had limits. In exile once more, Aristotle reflected on power's indifference to reason. Politics could create conditions for flourishing, but it could also destroy them. The philosopher could advise, analyze, and warn, but never fully control outcomes. This was not failure, it was realism. Aristotle had mapped politics without romance. He had shown how power worked, how it decayed, and how it might be restrained. But he had also revealed reason's vulnerability. Systems required more than logic. They required courage, humility, and ethical commitment. As his life drew toward its close, Aristotle understood something with painful clarity. Knowledge could illuminate paths. It could not force anyone to walk them. The city would always be a fragile agreement between reason and desire. Philosophy could guide, but never rule outright. That dream belonged to Plato. Aristotle had learned better. And as he approached the end of his own journey, the fate of his work remained uncertain. His ideas were scattered across notes and lectures, preserved by students but ignored by politics. It seemed possible that his grand design might vanish with him. But history, unpredictable as nature itself, was preparing a different outcome, one that would carry Aristotle far beyond Athens, far beyond Greece, into the very foundations of civilization. And the world would not know whether to thank him or fear him. Aristotle died far from the noise of Athens, in the quiet town of Chalcis, his body weakened, but his mind still restless. There was no grand procession, no public reckoning, no sense that the world had just lost one of its most consequential thinkers. In his final years, he was not a celebrated authority, but a cautious exile, once again reminded that cities rarely know what to do with those who explain them too well. He left instructions for his family, care for his children, and the stewardship of his writings. Then he was gone. For a time, it seemed as though his work might fade with him. Unlike Plato, Aristotle did not write for posterity. His surviving texts were not polished dialogues meant to seduce future readers. They were dense, technical, and unapologetically demanding. Many were lecture notes, never intended for wide circulation. Without Aristotle's voice to animate them, they were difficult, even forbidding. And the world was changing. Alexander's empire fractured almost immediately after his death. Wars of succession tore the Hellenistic world apart. Libraries burned. Schools closed. Attention shifted from systematic inquiry to survival. Philosophy itself fragmented into competing schools: Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, each offering guidance for life amid uncertainty. Aristotle's encyclopedic ambition felt out of step with the age. His school, the Lyceum, endured for a time under his successors, but its influence waned. Manuscripts were copied imperfectly. Some were lost entirely. Others survived only in fragments. By the time Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean, Aristotle was more name than presence. For centuries, Plato eclipsed him. Then, quietly, Aristotle began to return. In the eastern reaches of the former empire, scholars preserved what they could. In Alexandria, texts were catalogued, debated, and translated. Later, in the Islamic world, Aristotle found new life. Thinkers in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba treated his works not as relics, but as foundations. They called him the first teacher. Philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes read Aristotle with intensity and reverence. They argued with him, expanded him, corrected him. They wove his logic into theology, his metaphysics into cosmology, his ethics into law. Through Arabic translation, Aristotle's thought was not frozen. It evolved. Ironically, it was this distance from Greece that saved him. By the time Aristotle's works re-entered Western Europe in the Middle Ages, they arrived not as tentative inquiries, but as complete systems. Latin translations carried his authority into monasteries and universities hungry for structure. After centuries of fragmentation, Aristotle offered coherence, and Europe embraced him. In medieval classrooms, Aristotle became more than a philosopher. He became a framework. Logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, all organized under his name. His categories shaped theology. His syllogisms structured debate. His vision of an intelligible universe aligned neatly with religious belief. But something subtle changed. Aristotle, the investigator, became Aristotle, the authority. His caution faded. His openness to revision hardened. Where he had invited observation, later scholars invoked his conclusions. Where he had warned against false certainty, certainty was now claimed in his name. This transformation was not malicious, it was human. Complex systems invite guardians. Guardians prefer stability, and Aristotle's system was so comprehensive that it appeared complete. To challenge it felt like challenging reason itself. For nearly 2,000 years, Western thought moved within the boundaries he had drawn. Science, philosophy, education, and theology leaned on Aristotle's shoulders. When medieval scholars spoke of the philosopher, they meant him. His ideas became so foundational that they disappeared into assumption. People did not argue with Aristotle, they argued through him. Yet reality does not remain still. Observations accumulated that Aristotle's physics could not explain. The heavens did not behave as his cosmology predicted. Motion defied his laws. Nature whispered contradictions. At first, these anomalies were ignored. Then they were explained away. Finally, they became impossible to dismiss. The scientific revolution did not overthrow Aristotle in a moment. It eroded him slowly. Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton did not hate Aristotle. They outgrew him. And in doing so, they rediscovered something crucial that had been buried under centuries of reverence. Aristotle himself had insisted on observation. The tragedy was not Aristotle's influence. It was forgetting his method while preserving his conclusions. As his authority declined in science, it persisted in ethics, logic, and political thought. His vocabulary still shaped how questions were asked, even when answers changed. Categories, causation, virtue, these remained deeply Aristotelian, whether acknowledged or not. By the modern era, Aristotle was no longer the final word, but he was the starting grammar. He had not merely contributed ideas, he had shaped the way thinking itself unfolded. From a man who died in quiet exile, uncertain of his legacy, Aristotle became one of the most influential minds in human history. His work survived conquest, religious transformation, and intellectual revolution. Yet this survival carried irony. The philosopher who warned against treating knowledge as fixed became a symbol of fixity. The thinker who embraced revision became a pillar of tradition. His afterlife was longer and stranger than any life he studied. And as the world finally began to question his authority, a deeper question emerged, one Aristotle himself might have appreciated. What happens when a mind explains so much that humanity forgets how to question it? The answer would shape the modern world, and it would force a final reckoning with the man who once tried to know everything. To understand Aristotle's final paradox, we must return to the tension that ran through his entire life. The tension between explanation and openness. Aristotle wanted to make sense of the world, not to dominate it, but to live well within it. And yet, once his ideas escaped his hands, they became instruments of certainty in a world that craved closure. The human mind, after all, longs for solid ground. Aristotle offered it. He taught that reality had structure, that causes could be traced, that knowledge could be organized rather than surrendered to myth. In eras of instability, this was not merely comforting, it was salvational. When empires collapsed and belief systems fractured, Aristotle's vision of an intelligible universe felt like an anchor dropped into chaos. But anchors can also hold ships in place when they need to move. By the early modern period, thinkers began to sense this weight. The heavens no longer aligned with Aristotelian cosmology. Objects fell and moved in ways his physics could not fully explain. New instruments, telescopes, microscopes, revealed realities Aristotle could never have observed. Nature was speaking again, and it was not repeating old answers. What followed was not a clean break, but a struggle. Galileo's conflict with authority was not just scientific, it was philosophical. To challenge Aristotle was to challenge the intellectual spine of Western education. Universities had been built around him. Theologians had woven him into doctrine. To doubt Aristotle felt like doubting reason itself. And yet, Aristotle would have understood. He had once walked away from Plato for the same reason. He had chosen observation over reverence, experience over inheritance. The irony is almost unbearable. The philosopher who taught the world how to question became the reason. Questioning stalled. Still, even in being surpassed, Aristotle remained present. Newton's laws replaced Aristotle's physics, but not his insistence on causation. Modern biology moved beyond Aristotle's classifications, but not his commitment to studying life as it actually exists. Ethics evolved, fractured, and diversified, but Aristotle's emphasis on character, habit, and flourishing never vanished. Even today, when we argue about purpose, we argue in Aristotelian terms, whether we know it or not. And perhaps this is where his story becomes most human. Aristotle did not offer salvation. He offered effort. He believed the good life required attention, discipline, and reflection. That happiness was not stumbled upon, but built slowly through choices that aligned reason and desire. That understanding the world was not an escape from responsibility, but its foundation. He also accepted limits. He knew chance mattered. He knew suffering could not always be explained away. He knew reason did not erase tragedy. This acceptance separated him from both prophets and ideologues. Aristotle was not selling certainty. He was offering orientation. So what, then, is the cost of believing him too completely? It is forgetting that systems are tools, not truths, that maps are not territories, that even the most powerful framework must eventually bend to new evidence. Aristotle's grand design was never meant to close inquiry. It was meant to make inquiry possible. In this sense, his legacy is not a monument, it is a challenge. Every generation must decide whether to inherit his conclusions or his courage, whether to preserve his categories or reenact his method, whether to quote him or to do what he did. Look closely, question patiently, refuse easy answers. The man who tried to know everything did not succeed because he reached the end of knowledge. He succeeded because he showed that the world could be approached without fear, that complexity was not an enemy, and that understanding was a lifelong pursuit. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Not that Aristotle was right, but that he was relentlessly curious. If we remember that, if we keep walking, observing, revising, then Aristotle remains not a shadow over thought, but a companion beside it, still asking, still moving, still unfinished.